Imagine a world where NATO loses its most powerful member, the US. What would be the consequences? US leaving NATO is unlikely, but can Trump even decide if the US will leave? Will NATO countries spend less than 2% of their GDP on defense amid the Ukraine war? If Trump wins and manages to exit NATO, what would the short-term geopolitical impact be? This video will also explore how would a hypothetical US exit affect the US, its stance against China and Russia, and Europe's defense against Russia. How might Russia and China react and profit from this? What would the impact on Ukraine and the war be? If Europe quickly assembled an army or formed another pact, would it include the UK? What might such an army look like? And how would it compare to Russia's military of today? The US leaving NATO might have wider economic repercussions, which might affect global economic supply chains. Those are hugely important. Without those, for example, I couldn't have gotten a good deal on these Raycon earbuds, which are sponsoring this video. My kid is going back to school soon, so these are technically for him, but he won't mind that I'm trying them out first. Cool thing is, these come with differently sized gel tips. Blue is both his and mine fave color, and these look great, though there's a bunch of other vibrant colors to choose from. Right now I'm using them when reviewing Binkov videos and doing video editing, so my Binkov office buddy isn't bothered all the time. Raycon earbuds feature active noise cancellation too, which again helped when my colleague is editing audio. I can get an hour and a half of life out of them after just 10 minutes of charging, but when fully charged I get 8 hours of playtime, and over 30 hours of battery life in total with the case. Best of all, the balanced sound and bass rival some of the biggest names in the audio business, while being more affordable at half the price, and a real snug, comfy fit. If you wanna get a pair, you're in luck. Binkov viewers who click the link in the video description or go to buyraycon.com/Binkov will get 20 to 40% off their purchase. And you'll get free shipping. Give them a try. In 2024, public opinion strongly favors continued US membership in NATO, with 2/3 of Americans supporting either an increase or maintenance of the current commitment. A US president cannot unilaterally withdraw from NATO. The 2024 National Defense Authorization Act requires congressional approval or a 2/3 Senate vote for such a decision, preventing unilateral action and potential constitutional crisis. The President directs military operations and can issue executive orders impacting NATO cooperation. However, Congress retains several powers as checks on the President's authority. Congress controls military funding, including appropriations for NATO, ensuring that the President cannot unilaterally finance military endeavors. Only Congress has the power to declare war, providing a check on the President's military authority. Congress can also pass laws mandating continued support for NATO, influencing foreign policy. Major shifts in military policy typically require cooperation between the President and Congress to secure funding and legislative support, highlighting the balance of power within the federal government. In 2024, 14 to 18 NATO members out of 32 will meet the 2% GDP defense spending target, driven by US pressures and the ongoing Ukraine conflict. This marks a decade of consistent budget increases, highlighting the alliance's commitment to collective defense. Trump told NATO allies during his presidency that the US would not defend any country being attacked by Russia that did not pay its bills. He added, "In fact, I would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want." NATO's 2024 annual report indicates that even traditionally defense-reluctant member states, such as Germany, are now willing to take a more active role in collective defense. Germany increased its defense spending to over $70 billion. Poland is the EU's and NATO's record holder when it comes to percentage of GDP invested in the military. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are all increasing their defense spending to around 3% of their GDP. For comparison, the UK, which is not in the EU, plans to reach 2.5% of their GDP by 2030. France too said it plans to closely align its spending with NATO's target. So realistically, given that NATO countries are now largely spending 2% of their GDP on defense, and that even if Trump wins the election and even if he wanted out, he would still need congressional approval on that, chances that US would leave NATO are minimal. The US benefits from NATO as it keeps it involved in European politics. The US military-industrial complex benefits from NATO. In a way, if Europe would run NATO, the US would sort of have a competitor, as European integration might become stronger and Europe's military industry might grow more powerful. Additionally, if it stays in NATO, the US can try to leverage its influence and reorient NATO into a possible front against China. So with all those issues at play, it's highly unlikely the US will actually exit NATO, an organization it largely steers itself as its biggest contributor. But for argument's sake, let's say the US does leave NATO. What would that mean? Without the US, NATO would lose approximately 40% of its military personnel, 31% of its tank fleet and major chunks of its infantry fighting vehicle and artillery inventory, not to mention most of the cruise and ballistic missile inventory. In addition, NATO would lose approximately 60% of its combat aircraft, two-thirds of its transport aircraft and most of its helicopter fleet. At sea, NATO without the United States would lose most of its aircraft carrier force potential and over half of its submarine and surface vessel forces. A key aspect of US military power is its ability to sustain action globally. The US's unrivaled global military infrastructure, logistical capabilities and mobility assets set it apart. This includes over 600 military transport aircraft. In addition to air mobility assets, the US maintains extensive land and sea logistics capabilities. These include approximately 27 ships dedicated to sustaining and sea lifting forces globally, as well as 12+ fixed land-based logistics sites for the Army and Marine Corps to ensure high readiness for any operation. These key land and naval force enablers are supported by over 800 bases in more than 70 countries. Without the US, NATO members would have only localized and limited overseas capabilities for rapid and sustained operations. The US nuclear umbrella significantly bolsters NATO's deterrence posture. US nuclear weapons in Europe, under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, provide a credible deterrent against Russia's nuclear arsenal. These arrangements ensure NATO allies, including non-nuclear states, have access to nuclear capabilities to deter potential threats and maintain strategic stability. Without NATO, the US would lose a key platform for global influence, leading to increased defense spending and reliance on costlier bilateral agreements, thereby weakening its strategic position against adversaries like China and Russia. The loss of Article 5, which guarantees a collective defense response from 32 member countries, would significantly undermine the US's security framework. Additionally, the US would lose access to NATO military bases in Europe, crucial for rapid deployment and power projection. In 2024, NATO European allies contributed $380 billion to collective defense. To maintain its current level of global security and defense commitments independently, the US might need to spend an additional 1 to 2% of its GDP on defense, translating to approximately $200 to $400 billion more annually. The US would lose NATO's robust intelligence sharing network, impacting its ability to preemptively address threats from adversaries like Russia and China. NATO's intelligence and cyber defense assets include the NATO Intelligence Fusion Center, which integrates intelligence from all 32 member countries, and the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia, which coordinates cyber defense strategies and intelligence sharing. Additionally, key non-US NATO intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assets consist of approximately 700 satellites of various configurations, drones and AWACS planes. The defense industry might experience short-term disruptions due to the restructuring of alliances and contracts. Moreover, trade relations and supply chains with NATO member states could become strained. American goods accounted for 55% of European arms imports from 2019 to 2023, totaling $23 billion in value. The F-35 jet, for example, relies on parts, components and systems sourced from multiple countries, including Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, Canada, the UK and Italy. Without NATO, the US may struggle to maintain a unified front against China, weakening its Indo-Pacific strategy and influence. The US would need to expedite and deepen alliances with countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia and India to counterbalance China. However, this would be challenging as the US might no longer be seen as a reliable partner. European members would feel more vulnerable to Russian aggression without the US security guarantee. This could lead to heightened anxiety against Eastern European countries and increased Russian influence. European NATO members would need to increase their defense spending beyond 2% targets to fill the void, potentially causing economic strain. Russia could perceive the US departure as a weakening of NATO, potentially emboldening its stance in Eastern Europe and other regions. Without the US, NATO's military deterrent would be reduced. Russia might exploit the perceived power vacuum to exert more influence over former Soviet states and Eastern Europe, intensifying efforts in Ukraine and other contested areas. Russia could use the US departure as propaganda, portraying it as a decline in Western unity and power. China might see the US departure from NATO as an opportunity to strengthen ties with Russia and other countries wary of Western dominance, leading to deeper military and economic cooperation. With a weakened NATO, China could expand its influence in Europe through economic investments and diplomatic efforts, leveraging its Belt and Road Initiative. Additionally, a US departure from NATO could result in a greater American focus on the Asia-Pacific region, prompting China to accelerate its military initiatives in the South China Sea, increasing regional tensions. Ukraine would likely face greater military and political pressure from China due to the diminished deterrent effect of a united NATO. With the US withdrawal, Ukraine could become less of a strategic priority, resulting in a slowdown or complete stoppage of US military aid. Reduced US military support could make it harder for Ukraine to sustain its defense, making a Russian victory more likely unless Europe significantly increases its industrial capacity and military aid to Ukraine. If Europe were to attempt to assemble a robust military force, it would face short-term challenges due to gaps in military capabilities such as air and missile defense, logistics, and heavy brigades. European countries have significantly relied on US military assets. Currently, the US maintains approximately 70,000 personnel in Europe, including a Stryker brigade and a combat brigade of helicopters. The US Air Force in Europe alone has around 240 fighter jets, 30 transport planes, and 15 aerial refueling tanker. The 6th Fleet possesses 4 destroyers, a command ship, several submarines, a few assault ships, and further support ships. The EU and the UK would face a critical decision on whether to unite under a single defense framework. Post-Brexit, the UK had preferred a separate, influential role in European security rather than join an EU-led military structure. The new Labour government in the UK, however, signaled it would like to reapproach the EU, economics-wise. With its significant defense capabilities, the UK might aim to shape the security architecture instead of merely joining an EU army. The UK favors bilateral and multilateral defense agreements outside the EU framework, such as the Joint Expeditionary Force with Nordic and Baltic countries and the AUKUS Pact with Australia and the US. These arrangements allow the UK to maintain strategic influence and demonstrate its commitment to global and regional security partnerships without the constraints of an EU-centric military alliance. The geopolitical landscape in Europe would shift, with Central and Eastern European countries such as Poland and the Baltic states taking a more prominent role due to their proximity to potential threats. This coalition might drive a new security initiative, supported by remaining NATO structures without the US, unless a credible new European-wide military is formed. Given the current political and structural realities within the EU, it's unknown if member states would happily hand over complete military command to centralized EU authority. It's possible a military pact or a hybrid national supranational military structure would be more feasible. This would resemble an alliance or a coalition similar to NATO, but likely with closer integration to compensate for the lack of US military power. But if it doesn't happen, and if the European NATO replacement becomes essentially an EU military pact, such a military would be able to maintain a budget of around $110 billion drawn from existing EU national defense budgets. That's if it manages to win 30% of the EU's combined defense budgets, which amounted to $380 billion in 2024. Such a EU military would likely have joint command structures and an operational headquarters, probably in Brussels, to manage day-to-day and strategic planning. National governments would contribute portions of their forces to maintain key capabilities and meet military requirements. It might consist of some 200,000 personnel, including combat troops, support staff, and administrative personnel. This force would provide the EU with robust and flexible capabilities to address various security challenges. For context, the total number of military personnel in EU member states is over 1.5 million, indicating that a dedicated EU army would be a significant but manageable subset of existing national forces. The EU army could potentially be organized into several divisions, comprising infantry, armored, and artillery units. Additionally, it could establish a US-style Special Forces Command with several thousand operators pulled from national armies. An EU Air Force would still be an impressive force, able to form a modern fleet of almost 1,600 combat aircraft when all of today's fleets are tallied together. While the fighter force is strong, EU nations lack sufficient aerial surveillance platforms, with only 15 such aircraft. Despite this limitation, an EU Air Force would still be a capable force, effectively able to defend EU sovereignty. An EU Navy would be a formidable force, able to call upon and build a diverse fleet of modern ships from national inventories. Key vessels in such a force could include France's Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, Italy's Cavour aircraft carrier, Spain's Juan Carlos I amphibious assault ship, and many other ships, likely operating either vertical landing F-35s or Rafale jets. All those would provide a versatile force to secure the EU interests at sea, even far from home. An EU army would draw on the extensive experience of its member states, including participation in NATO missions such as peacekeeping in the Balkans and counter-terrorism in Afghanistan. It would also leverage operational expertise from EU-led missions such as the anti-piracy operations of the Horn of Africa and counter-smuggling efforts in the Mediterranean. However, EU armies largely lack actual war experience compared to the US. In 2024, the European Union's military-industrial complex is robust and expanding. It has an estimated turnover of $76 billion, employs around 500,000 people, and exports goods worth over $30 billion annually. If an EU military were created, the complex would undergo significant changes. These changes would be driven by the need for better defense capabilities, strategic autonomy, and technological advancements. The European Defense Agency could become the leading coordinator for all research and development programs and receive a substantial funding boost from a $110 billion budget. This budget would allocate 15% or $16 billion to research and development. The funding would support major projects such as the Eurodrone for surveillance and the main ground combat system for next-generation tanks. The greatest research focus will likely be on the Franco-German Future Combat Air System. This program would aim to address the lack of EU stealth fighter designs and counter the advancement of the Russian Su-57. The Russian armed forces have undergone significant changes due to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The war has impacted force structure, equipment, and strategic priorities. Future planned changes and modernization efforts are crucial to understanding the comparative capabilities of a hypothetical EU army. Proposed military reforms in 2022 include increasing personnel from 1.1 million to 1.5 million. Transformation of dozens of brigades into 22 divisions is planned. New air regiments and brigades will be added. These reforms strengthen Russia's military beyond the war in Ukraine. No significant changes in Russia's foreign and security policy are expected. Russia will likely continue its aggressive stance towards nearby NATO countries. The future capability of Russian forces to pose a broader threat will depend on multiple interconnected factors, including the ability to mitigate further losses of experienced personnel, industrial capacity to produce and refit military equipment, the quality of trained troops and materials, and the geopolitical landscape. While Russia aims to outlast Western support for Ukraine, the ultimate outcome will be shaped by military successes in Ukraine, the political landscape, and economic potential. As a quick comparison, we can say that Russia would be outnumbered by the EU military when it comes to combat jets. Russia is far from the tank powerhouse it once was due to the war. It tries to maintain a force of roughly 2,000 tanks, which is not easy with constant losses. So most of those tanks are actually old refurbished tanks from the Cold War era. EU's tank fleet is both more numerous and more modern at some 4,000 tanks. Russia currently has a bit fewer military personnel than the EU combined, but its numbers are scheduled to increase. It remains to be seen if EU numbers will follow suit. Actual army and related personnel is also a bit higher in the EU, for now. While worn out due to the war, it's also important to note that Russian military is gaining tremendous experience in Ukraine, both at command level and at the level of individual soldiers. With no wars of such scale to be trained on, the EU army would likely be less experienced. Still, the EU is more than equipped to deal with any possible war with Russia, even if no other country helps it. Its success in battle would depend on the actual internal politics of the EU and its unity. The US leaving NATO would still be a big blow. It would weaken the alliance's military and strategic capabilities, disrupt Western unity, and embolden adversaries like Russia and China. Europe would face significant security challenges, requiring major reorganization of its defense structures. European NATO members would need to increase their defense spending and capabilities, becoming more self-reliant. An EU army or a more integrated European military pact would be a critical response. This new structure would need substantial investment, coordination, and political will to match NATO's current capabilities. In the near term, Europe would be a bit more vulnerable to any possible Russian aggression, necessitating immediate reinforcement of Eastern European defenses. Over time, a unified and capable European defense force could emerge, able to act as a credible deterrent to rivals such as Russia. While US exit from NATO would pose significant challenges, it could also push Europe towards greater strategic autonomy and a more integrated defense posture, reshaping future international security alliances. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.